Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Monday, March 30th, 2020. Yesterday morning, Kathee and I woke up to the news that her first cousin, Brian Shatter, had passed away on Saturday night in Detroit. I've mentioned him a couple of times in recent weeks. Brian was the manager of a tire store. And in early March, we're told, one of his employees fell ill, and Brian gave him a ride to an urgent care facility. And that's where the family believes he was exposed to the coronavirus. And there were some errors, some problems in his treatment. He initially went to the hospital himself and spent 3 or 4 days, and then he was released because the doctors didn't have any coronavirus tests, and they couldn't actually say that his symptoms were directly caused by the coronavirus. So he spent, we think, 3 or 4 days at home, possibly infecting his wife and a son and a grandchild who were living there. He then was checked back into the Beaumont Hospital in Dearborn, and it appears he was connected up to one of the last available ventilators in the 8 facilities of the Beaumont Hospital chain. And you probably know that Governor Gretchen Whitmer has been pleading with the Trump White House for more ventilators, along with all the other equipment that is either non-existent or in short supply all across the nation. And from what we know, Brian was on the ventilator for 5 or 6 days. And at 2 different points in about day 3 and day 5, he was administered some medications that were last-ditch efforts to save him. And we got encouraging news on Friday night that the latest drug appeared to have reduced his reliance on the ventilator from something like 90% to 70%. And so when we, of course, as everyone does these days, stayed home and watched a great new flick on Netflix called Uncorked, we were hopeful. And Sunday morning, Kathee was up before me, and she delivered the sad news from Detroit. Brian had passed away sometime on Saturday evening. He was 63 years old, described as generally healthy, a little overweight, a smoker. But everyone who knows him described Brian as a fighter. Now, Kathee's from a very big family, Lebanese-American, 3rd generation, all hard-working and successful people in Detroit. And I met Brian a couple of times at family reunions. We had brief conversations because he knew I had been a DJ and he was a rock and roll fan. I know his brother Tim. We spent some time visiting in Florida when we traveled there in February. And I know his dad, Kathee's Uncle Eddie, who is 94 and in a nursing home in Dallas, where a son and a granddaughter live. And when Brian fell ill, because the nursing home was locked down, the son had to sneak in to get a visit with his dad so he could explain it personally. But I believe that Eddie got the news by telephone because this cruel virus has us all in a form of quarantine. And this tragedy is something that is being replicated in far too many cases. And what's so cruel for so many people is that once diagnosed and hospitalized, a COVID patient can have no visitors. And on the ventilator, Brian was not able to communicate much in what turned out to be his final days. So I share this with you because for us it became very personal. And while I don't want to inject politics yet, we'll get to that in short order. Detroit is now the number 5 hotspot in the country. And without acrimony, I simply report that many family members in Detroit are Trump supporters. Some were voting against Hillary. Others felt that lower taxes and even a wall were policies that they supported. I don't know Brian's politics these days, but in Detroit in general, we have compelling reports that many people there just didn't believe it. And now to the politics. I held off as long as I could. I don't blame Trump for the virus. And I can't blame Trump directly for Brian Shatter's miserable death. But the blue sky bullshit that Trump has been promoting, that has been well documented, that he now distances himself from and denies he ever said, they're part of the underlying cause. And Brian couldn't get testing on his first hospitalization, and when he went back the second time, it took 4 days to get the positive diagnosis. And this is criminal negligence on a massive scale, driven by a president who believes he is the only real victim of this pandemic, and his callous disregard of the risk to many Americans, including his supporters, in a state that was instrumental, critical, in delivering him the White House in the 2016 election. And you know I don't believe the results from Detroit and Michigan are legitimate. We have covered with Greg Palast how in the county that Detroit is situated in, there were some 60,000 ballots that were submitted by voters that showed no vote for president. And in a city that is still recovering from a Republican-imposed bankruptcy, a city whose population has declined by more than half from its peak, and the balance of the population is largely poverty-stricken African Americans. And to imagine that they didn't vote for either Clinton or Trump, well, it's not credible. So we mourn the passing of Brian Shatter and the impact on his family. 3 kids, 4 brothers and a sister, his elderly dad, a wife, a number of grandchildren. And I know this is not likely to be the last of stories that impact me directly or indirectly. And I share this with you not asking for your sympathy, but hoping that it will help drive home to the cult members of the Trump tribe and others who remain in denial about the threat that's posed. And even today, I turned on Rush Limbaugh. He's back from his own treatment for cancer. His lifespan appears to be limited. And he was there using statistics to try to claim that, this is not that severe. It's all being hyped by the media. And I see that replicated in my Facebook friends, people who remain in denial, even one guy who just said there is no virus. And that is the tragedy of a divided nation, driven by partisan propaganda on both sides. And I sadly predict that we are going to reach six-figure losses of life. The numbers in Detroit, 5,400 cases reported as of Sunday. 132 people in Detroit have died, making Michigan fifth across the nations in deaths from the virus. Governor Whitmer has finally issued a stay-at-home order. Happened last week. But she is in a dicey position because Michigan, a reliable blue state for generations, has become purple. And every elected official has to consider the political impact and whether or not they can actually move the population to action when so many people are in a form of willful denial. New York now has 253 more deaths. That's just in a 24-hour period. There's a total of 1,218 who've died, 65,000 confirmed cases. And I'm grateful to Linda Lewis, who helps compile a daily digest of the impact of coronavirus for me. So nationwide, the death toll is just above 2,400, according to the CDC, which is trending a little behind. About 141,000 cases confirmed nationwide, and we know that's going to go up because there is now more testing available. Worldwide, the caseload is north of 600,000, and almost 30,000 deaths have been reported. In Spain and Italy, the reports of the past day alone each tallied the exact same number, 812 new deaths. And as you know, Trump holds these bizarre briefings with the media, which continues to give him way too much exposure. And because of the competitive nature of the networks, they carry it live. And this is the same kind of free media that they gave Trump in 2016, billions of dollars worth of free media coverage. And this is their way of keeping eyeballs on the tube, with more Americans to avail, stuck at home. Some 200 million people are now under stay-at-home orders in the United States alone. And Linda has recapped for me the key developments just of the last 3 days related to Trump. So on Friday, 800,000 doctors from across the country signed a letter imploring Trump to reverse his call for so-called reopening America by Easter, April 12th. The Council of Medical Specialty Societies and a number of other organizations called for leadership from the president, which would be about as novel as the novel coronavirus. And in his continuing blame-shifting, demonization of governors who have the temerity to publicly say they're not getting what they need. Well, Trump said Friday that he's told Mike Pence not to return phone calls from governors who aren't appreciative of his administration's efforts to slow the spread in their states. He singled out Jay Inslee of Washington State and Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, who I mentioned, both whom have been critical of the White House actions, Trump said that Pence calls all the governors, and I tell him I'm a different type of person, and I say, Mike, don't call the governor of Washington. You're wasting your time. Don't call the woman in Michigan. It doesn't make any difference what happens. Now, that's a cringe-worthy statement. It doesn't make any difference what happens. And even when we reduce it to the base calculations of this idiot in the White House, as I mentioned, he needs Michigan if he expects to win a second term. And you'd think he would see beyond his little spats, his condescension and criticism of these governors who are trying to help their people. But no, he is the single biggest victim of this pandemic, at least in his own mind. Then on Saturday, and I saw some of this, I've been trying to limit my own exposure to him because I just get so angry. And it's redoubled with the death of Kathee's first cousin. But I watched him in a photo op as the U.S. Navy medical ship Comfort left Norfolk. And why did it take so long? I don't know if they had to assemble crews or resupply the ship. But he used that moment to threaten a quarantine of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And then later in the day, he backed off. Now, no responsible leader would make a significant statement like that and put a lot of people on edge if he hadn't made up his mind. But that's the way he operates. So, 8 p.m., he tweeted, "A quarantine will not be necessary." And Anthony Fauci announced that basically he'd talked the president off that ledge and into a voluntary travel ban from that area. And we know in Rhode Island, the cops are staging checkpoints, and when a car with New York plates comes by, they stop and quiz the people, and in certain cases, demand that they either leave Rhode Island or enter into a self-styled quarantine, isolation. Then on Sunday, I actually did watch about 10 minutes of Trump's performance art. And at the moment I tuned in, he seemed to have lapsed into some sort of lucidity. He was talking honestly about the risks that we face. I heard him extend the federal, it's a suggestion, that people continue to observe social distancing practices. But he also, as he extended the period until April 30th, he rolled out a new word in his limited vocabulary, aspirational. And that was used to describe and to try to walk back his previous statements that he was determined to, quote, reopen the country on Easter Sunday. He said, that was just aspirational. And this is a man who can't own up to being wrong in any way. And he gets into tussles with reporters who quote his own comments verbatim to him and dismisses them as fake news, people who ask nasty questions. And Yamiche Alcindor, who is the White House reporter for the PBS NewsHour, is impressive in the way she refuses to be intimidated. I saw a picture of some White House goon trying to take the microphone away from her as Trump was attacking her. And he basically said, gosh, you work for PBS and you used to work for the New York Times. And that she needed to ask him nicer questions. So Trump first denied that he had made the comments before accusing Yamiche Alcindor of acting threatening. He said, why don't you act in a little more positive? I mean, that's not even a complete sentence. It's always getcha, getcha, getcha. You know what? That's why nobody trusts the media anymore. That's why you used to work for the New York Times, and now you work for somebody else. Look, let me tell you something. Be nice. Don't be threatening. Now, he is threatened by the readback of his own lies. And one of the exchanges that I did see was Trump calling on a reporter from the little network from San Diego that is just a suck up to Trump 24/7. It's called OEN or OAN, One America News. And that reporter tossed him a puffball, and he said, OAN, oh, that's a beautiful question. That's a beautiful question. And her question was something about how these laggards in the media keep messing up the reporting because Trump is so successful and has done everything perfectly. It's just tragic as people are getting sick, dying, living in fear. And this is what we have. So back to Linda's summary today. There are caseloads surging in rural areas. Counties like Gunnison, Colorado, Blaine County, Idaho, Summit County, Utah, are now seeing a recent surge in infections. And Trump has argued before he kind of changed his tune about the Easter Bunny that, there are big parts of the country that aren't affected by this. Why should we shut down their economies? But it truly is everywhere. And to his credit, Dr. Fauci, despite all the dances he has to do with Trump, including some at close proximity that violate the guidelines, la distancia in Spanish, Fauci said that based on modeling, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw over 100,000 deaths. And some of those models show that the numbers could be 200,000 or higher. Here in California, Governor Newsom reported that the state received a shipment of ventilators and 170 of them were broken. He explained on Saturday they came from the national stockpile directly to Los Angeles. And he said, and this is what you have to do. You cannot appear to be attacking Trump. He said, rather than complaining, rather than pointing fingers, rather than generating headlines, we just sent them to a shop in Silicon Valley, and they fixed them. Now, before the pandemic, California had an estimated 7,500 ventilators across the state. And Newsom is trying to add at least 10,000 more. And as of Saturday, California had acquired about 4,200, 1,000 of which need repair. The face mask, the personal protection equipment, the PPE, continue to be in short supply. And in another one of his bizarre rants, Trump has suggested that hospitals are hoarding this stuff. And he told reporters they should dig into it. and so he turns everything into issues that relate to himself, to his need for narcissistic supply. And in a tweet before the press event on Sunday, he attacked the media. And I don't have the exact time, but I believe it was Sunday evening. He went on Twitter to brag about the great ratings he's getting. That his numbers are even better than one of the big episodes of The Apprentice. Now, this is just fucking sick. I worked in media for a long time, and I did many, many little silly things to try to jack up the ratings. We even did big things, like buying audiences with cash giveaways. But in a context like this, where your ratings and the adulation that you believe you deserve are more important than the job you're supposed to be doing, well, we've reached a new low. And here's a little more about his tiff with governors and his claim that he gets Mike Pence to call them back. He said, I don't have to call because I'm probably better off not. Jay Inslee is a nasty person and a failed presidential candidate. I don't like the governor of Washington, so you know who calls? I get Pence to call. I get the head of FEMA to call. I get the admiral to call. Because when they disrespect me, they're disrespecting our government. And these people have bent over backwards at the risk of damaging their own reputations, trying not to respond in kind, and trying to, as Mike Bloomberg might say, just get the job done. Oh, and here's more blue sky bullshit from him. During this period, it's very important to strongly follow the guidelines. We can expect, after extending this to April 30th, that by June 1st, we will be well on our way to recovery. I think by June 1, a lot of great things are going to be happening. He doesn't know that. That's as arbitrary as the way he picked Easter. Aides in the White House said that Trump was muted during the task force meeting before Sunday's news event. His mind almost entirely made up for the extension. One said the president recognized the data about the impact of the virus was bad and could not be bent to his will. And it appears that personal accounts like my family's experience with the loss of Brian have actually gotten through to him. After he cited repeatedly predictions that up to 2.2 million Americans could die from the virus if nothing were done, he talked about its viciousness and revealed that it had sent a friend to the hospital. He's a little older and he's heavy, but he's a tough person. And he went to the hospital, and a day later he's in a coma. Elliptically, I guess, citing a comment from one of his underlings, how's he doing? Sir, he's in a coma. He's unconscious. He's not doing well. And back to Trump's voice, the speed and viciousness, especially if it gets the right person, is horrible. That's one of his old standby vocabulary terms. And the Washington Post gets it right in this brief squib today. Trump is fighting a three-pronged war against the virus, governors, and the media. And after recapping what I just told you about the extension of the policies, they note that Trump is fighting a three-pronged war. Quote, Trump, who now fashions himself a wartime president in a re-election year, is not only fighting the virus, he's also still sparring with two other constituencies, the nation's governors and the media. And to their credit, many of the people he attacks are more grown up than him. Governor Whitmer, Michigan, said on Meet the Press that their hospitals are already at capacity. Dire straits again in a matter of days, not enough ventilators, and that she does not have time to respond to every slight that comes from the president or his Twitter box. Jay Inslee dodged a question about Trump's attacks on him by saying that governors could use a more coordinated federal response. Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards, who is facing a big surge there, we believe because of Mardi Gras, said that, he's trying to do the job. He's frustrated. We don't know if we don't flatten the curve. We're on a trajectory currently to exceed our capacity in New Orleans for ventilators by April 4th. That's this coming Saturday. All beds will be occupied by about April 10th. So that's what I can tell you about the antics of the president. And I want to cite for you a couple of quotes from an op-ed printed in The Guardian today by Micah Zenko. He says, the Trump administration forced a catastrophic strategic surprise onto the American people. The current one was brought about by unprecedented indifference, even willful negligence. And he cites last week's Washington Post report about how the intelligence community kept feeding him reports in January and February, and he ignored them and told the public, we have it totally under control. It's just one person coming in from China. We have it under control. It's going to be just fine. And the writer says there are 3 observations to share. First, that once he believes absolutely anything, no matter how poorly thought out, ill-informed, or inaccurate, he remains completely anchored to that initial impression or judgment. Leaders are unusually hubristic and overconfident. For many, the fact that they have risen to elevated levels of power is evidence of their inherent wisdom. But truly wise leaders authentically solicit feedback and criticism, and Trump can't do that. Number 2, his judgments are highly transmissible, infecting the thinking and behavior of nearly every official or advisor who comes into contact with him. And, of course, the fear of being tweeted or drummed out of the White House causes most people to behave like a well-trained dog. That's my line. And third, the poor judgments soon contaminate all the policy-making arms of the federal government with almost no resistance or even reasonable questioning. It is a top-down form of March Madness, a very different version than we usually experience. And today, I recorded a great in-depth interview with Scott Ritter, the former UN's weapons inspector and a guy with a career background in marine intelligence. And he writes so effectively. And I think he is a strong analyst who puts aside any political leanings. And we talked about 3 main subjects that are covered in 3 articles that Ritter has published in the last couple of weeks. And the first is about a failure of intelligence related to an obscure agency that is a subset of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And it is tasked with forward-looking projections on what kind of threats are posed to American soldiers, including the 300 who participated in a sporting competition in Wuhan province in China in October of last year. Scott also talks about how COVID-19 has exposed the broken American economy. We have a lengthy exchange about that I think was really good. And in the third portion of the interview, I give Scott the floor to explain a recent piece where he talked about Russia's new oil war, which is nominally aimed at Saudi Arabia, but actually will harm the U.S. economy and our oil patch even more. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Scott Ritter.
The National Center for Medical Intelligence doesn't have assets. They're a small group. They have a division that does viral epidemiology and investigates that, but they task. Their job is to task and then receive information. They task the greater intelligence community, which does have the ability, if they don't have assets in place, to reach out. And I'll give you an example of why this is especially an intelligence failure. In October of 2019, the United States sent 300 military personnel to Wuhan to participate in the international military games. One of the NCMIA's jobs is to prepare the exact same thing they prepared for me as a weapons inspector, sort of an intelligence report on this is the threat that you could be facing in China from, infectious diseases. Now, it's not as though China never appeared on the map. We know that, H1N1 and other diseases came from China. We know that China is a cesspool of potential viral and epidemics. China's been on our radar for years. And so the question is, in preparing this intelligence report for these 300 military personnel, did they do any predictive work? Did they task the CIA to get into the Wuhan infectious disease center to find out if there's anything going on? Did they send operatives in to take samples from Chinese citizens? These are the things that intelligence agencies do. This is how you fight. This is how you get ahead of pandemics, by going out and doing the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You don't just sit and wait for this to happen. You go and actively collect the intelligence.
That's Scott Ritter, and I encourage you to listen to the full interview at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker. And if you don't have a subscription, do you know that you can hear the interview for just $1? Go to my website, peterbcollins.com/signup, and when you scroll down, you will see the $1 24-hour pass. And let me take this moment to thank the people who support me every day with your subscriptions. Aidan McAleer, Faith Peoples, Benny Alto, who listens all the way to the bitter end, he told me that, and Clifford Johnson. I appreciate you, and I thank you for your support. Macy's, one of the largest retail department stores in the country, is bowing to reality and has announced a furlough of 130,000 workers across the country, and many of those people work just above the minimum wage. It's going to be hard. The biggest newspaper chain in the country, Gannett, which did undergo a change of ownership last year, and I never pick up the rag because, with the exception of the local papers that can do a decent job of local coverage, it's a very bland and timid news outlet that I don't pay much attention to. But Gannett will furlough employees over the next 3 months to cut costs. People who earn more than $38,000 a year there will be required to take 1 week of unpaid leave each month, April, May, and June. Now, the CEO has announced that he's not going to take any pay until he restores his workers to full compensation. That's a nice thing. And I'll note that across the country, because Major League sports have been put on hold and nobody can stage a concert or a nightclub event or theater, that the critics and the sports writers have already been sidelined. And Facebook, here's a little good news. It's one of the outlets that sucked out all of the cash from the advertising that the old school media, the legacy media, used to base their own economics on. Mark Zuckerberg, to his credit, announced today a $100 million pledge to help news media outlets that have been starved of advertising revenue because of the pandemic. $75 million it's described as marketing spend. I don't understand that term. But $25 million will be emergency grants through the Facebook Journalism Project. Dolly G, you might want to ridicule that name. But Dolly G is a very influential federal judge on the bench in Los Angeles. And for years, she has presided over the Flores case, which relates to regulation of the detention of minors, those under the age of 18, in our immigration system. Now, many of those people have been handed off from ICE and the Border Patrol to Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. There are over 5,000 children in detention across the country. And Judge G has ordered the administration to make every effort to promptly and safely release thousands of them. I don't know if it's each and every one. By April 6th, the government must provide the court all data on all minors not released by then, including names, dates of apprehension, places of detention, and why they haven't been released. Now, because of the original Flores decision, this order applies to California, Illinois, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, and the state of Washington. And by April 9th, court-approved juvenile coordinators who work for ICE and the Office of Refugee Resettlement shall provide the court and the special monitor with a report regarding whether their facilities are at, above, or below capacity and the status of the implementation of her order. And I'm sorry to report that Governor Newsom here in California and Governor Cuomo in New York are highly resistant to any further releases of state prisoners. Let me say that as somebody who has visited my nearby prison, San Quentin, hundreds of times, whenever I go in, whether it's in the more open general visiting room or in the cages where you visit one-on-one with a death row prisoner, it always reminds me that we do need prisons. We have people who are not safe in the community. And I don't call for releasing everyone. But with the California state prison system still above its approved capacity, there are about 110, 114,000 in incarceration right now. They're elderly nonviolent offenders. There are younger nonviolent offenders. There are people with established illness. And to the extent possible, I believe they should be released or at least furloughed for now, even if they don't all end up back in captivity. Now, there are issues about where they go. Many of these people are criminals because they don't have a home, they don't have a family, and they don't have a place to go. But if we are going to deal with the least among us, the homeless, and our prison populations, we've got to figure out a way to handle it. I want to note, and it pains me to say this, but so many people have already died, so many more are likely to, that we can't do individual obituaries for every victim of COVID. But one person who died over the weekend is a man I met last year in Tribeca in New York. His name, Michael Sorkin, one of architecture's most outspoken public intellectuals, a man who brought social justice to his agenda of design of buildings and public spaces. And I mention him because I was so impressed with the book that we focused on a lot last year. Vanessa Keith, also an architect, edited the book called 2100, Dystopian Utopia. And that was a project of the Terraform Center that Michael Sorkin set up in the mid-2000s. And it was a brilliant, forward-looking and novel way of supporting writers with an architectural background and inviting them to do very unusual analyses. And Vanessa Keith's book is just one of many titles. So I got to spend about 20 minutes with him, and he was a superstar in many ways, and I wanted to note his passing. On Saturday, I put up a comment on Facebook, and I got mostly supportive remarks except from stupid people. And I wrote this: now that we have a better idea of what's actually in the bailout stimulus package, a few observations. This is a product of democratic socialism, though corporate interests benefit over people at about a 6-to-1 ratio. It addresses the needs of minimum wage workers, giving them the same $600 a week bump in unemployment benefits as everyone else. It provides a $5,000 tax credit to employers who help pay off student loan balances. And most of all, it sets up government-paid universal health care, even if limited in time and scope to COVID-19. In a nutshell, this is the Bernie Sanders agenda that so many boomer Democrats have been led to fear. And I said, when you receive these benefits, please show some gratitude to Bernie. Well, there's no such thing in this latest hit piece of the Washington Post. Headline: Bernie Sanders says he's staying in the presidential race. Many Democrats fear a reprise of their 2016 defeat. Now, this article runs 22 pages. They go into great depth, but they barely scratch the surface on Joe Biden's deep defects, his political baggage, and the way that he's been put in a bubble by the corporate media and Democratic leaders in their effort to stop Sanders. And so now, instead of blaming the Russians for giving Donald Trump the election in 2016, they're blaming Bernie because he stayed in the race too long, and despite the argument by Sanders supporters that they did that to try to affect the platform, and they felt they did have some impact. They quote a parade of Hillary supporters who are now Biden supporters. One, Philippe Reines, who was a longtime advisor to Clinton, big on the campaign. It's the equivalent of a World War II kamikaze pilot. Bernie supporters have no better option than to plow into USS Biden. So they believe that the whole process, the nominating process, is in the bag for their guy, Joe Biden. They ridicule Sanders' call for a debate in April. And in this lengthy piece, they don't ever mention the name Tara Reade. And if her name is unfamiliar to you, it's because the corporate media has blacked it out. I don't watch the Sunday morning political shows, but a Facebook friend reported that Chuck Todd had a lengthy interview with Joe Biden on, I guess that's Meet the Press on Sunday. Never mentioned Tara Reade or the bubbling acceptance or at least the calls for her to be heard by people who believe she is a credible complainant. And her complaint is that when she was on Joe Biden's Senate staff in 1993, he grabbed her, kissed her, and he inserted his finger into her vagina. That is a form of rape. It's not just inappropriate touching, sniffing of hair, calling somebody honey. This is a serious charge. And it deserves to be aired out. And if Democrats don't do it, we know that Trump's hypocritical supporters will do it sometime before the November election. They mention a quote from Anita Dunn, another slam at Bernie, who after the last debate that we saw compared Sanders to the kind of protester who often shows up at campaign events on live television. Now, Anita Dunn was a paid consultant to TransCanada to try to grease the passage of the Keystone XL pipeline. And more recently, she advised Harvey Weinstein on damage control from the array of women who made allegations against him. And again, this lengthy article makes no mention of Tara Reade and this emerging scandal. Also, at the relatively neutral publication called The Week, Ryan Cooper writes, Joe Biden is the worst imaginable challenger to Trump right now, noting that Trump's approval ratings continue to rise as he lies his way through this pandemic and his failed response. Also, at Mint Press News, a great reveal on the foreign policy advisors on Joe Biden's team, and the unintentional reveal from Thomas Wright, the director of the Center on U.S. and Europe for the influential think tank, the Brookings Institute. Biden's team, according to Alan McLeod at Mint Press, he's quite an impressive reporter. Biden's team believes the U.S. entire industrial policy should be designed about how to compete with China. Top priorities are dealing with authoritarian governments and include defending democracy and tackling corruption, as well as understanding how these challenges intersect with 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and synthetic biology. And don't forget mass surveillance. So it's an interesting piece, and I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. McLeod also has a great report on the weaponization of the coronavirus related to Venezuela. So the Maduro government, called a regime by those who oppose it, made a request of the International Monetary Fund, the center of disaster capitalism. And the IMF has said, yeah, sure, we'll give Venezuela emergency loans to deal with the COVID outbreak, but only if Maduro steps down. This is weaponizing, attempting to achieve a political objective by expanding the potential misery of millions of Venezuelans. And over at Gray Zone, a new article from Leonardo Flores noting the $15 million bounty on Maduro announced by the United States last week, along with phony allegations of drug trafficking, in particular cocaine. And Flores, he's a crazy guy because he uses information from the American Drug Enforcement Administration, their own maps showing the movement of cocaine north from South America. And the heavy traffic comes directly from Colombia, a lot of it into Mexico, some of it into U.S. ports or U.S. states. And you can look at this yourselves. I have posted a link to this article in the show file at peterbcollins.com. There are just a few sketchy lines from Venezuela into the United States. And Mr. Flores writes, it cannot be denied that Venezuela is a transit country for cocaine, but less than 7% of total drug movement from South America transits through Venezuela. These maps produced by the DEA immediately raise questions as to why Venezuela is the country being targeted. There's more in the piece, and I encourage you to read it. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. And just one last thing. If you are on Facebook and you follow me on Facebook, Sunday night is a little musical therapy. I posted about 15 times to YouTube links to songs that I really like and that I want to share with people. And if you enjoy a range of music, I've got John Coltrane in there, the Keith Hartley Band from the 1970s, some music from Michael Franti and Spearhead, Curtis Mayfield, some Motown tunes, and others. Just drop by my, do we still call it a wall? My page, Peter B. Collins on Facebook. And if you're not already a friend, just send me a friend request. And if you don't look too weird, I will likely accept it. Thanks for joining me for my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it everywhere, including Venezuela. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.